in this demo, I'm going to show you how to create your own fonts from scratch. I have 3 steps in my process. First, I sketch the letters in a program like Krita, something you can draw in, and you can use anything that you're comfortable with. Then, I take those sketches and I put them into Inkscape, and then I go over them and make vectors for each one. Finally, I take each vector and then I put it into fontforge and then make a shape. That's the overall view. What we're going to do in this demo is I'm going to sketch 5 letters in krita and show you tips on how I align everything and things to keep in mind when sketching. Then I'm going to show you how to vectorize them in Inkscape. And then I'll show you how to get them from Inkscape into fontforge to then make an actual font with. Finally, I'm going to show you how to put them into Godot. In the description, I also have how to put them into Unity and Unreal. I have some video tutorials how to get TTF, OTF files into other engines. I want to quickly talk about font ideation. How do you come up with an idea for a font? For a decorative font that's supposed to look pretty, you want it to have a recognizable shape. So you don't want to have a too complicated shape, but you want something recognizable. So here's some examples. We have like a claw marks, blood, things like that. You see it and it doesn't need to do much work in order to express what is it. Crab claw has a very, very unique shape and it's not going to be mistaken for anything else. Hair has a very interesting shape and it is very recognizable. And then the sun, with the cartoon lines coming out the sun, is very recognizable what it is. When your shape is too complicated, it creates a more silly kind of result. And if that's what you want, that's good. But if you're trying to make a font that's like a clean, subtle approach, you don't want a too complicated shape, basically. Whereas these fonts here with the cats and the dogs, it's an entire cat. It's more difficult to read it, and it's more difficult to even think what is the letter going to look like. And it has like a silly effect, which might not be what you're going for. So yeah, simple shapes when you're trying to be very subtle with your font, but still express the idea. For the demonstration today, I'm going to make a font based on dandelion seeds. It has a very unique shape, very recognizable, and it has some things that I can play with. The first thing I want to talk about is how to set up your krita or your drawing program so that you are careful about how to arrange the letters. So there's some things here, the capital height, the X height, the descender, and the ascender. And then also width is important. I take these lines and I extend them. And you'll notice that my canvas is very long, and that's because I like to write the letters one after another, and I don't like to have them all at different heights. Make it easier for me. Okay, and then so that I don't get confused, I like to change the colors of the capitals. So now I have my lowercase height, I have my capital height, I have my ascender and descender. You can move these. The only thing you have to do is just be consistent. So you can move these wherever you want, but they just have to be consistent so that all the letters don't end up looking completely different, unless you're going for that. The way that I like to gauge where do I want these lines to be is I create a text box and then I pick a font. Any font will do. So I pick one that kind of is similar to the font that I'm creating. So I'm making the font that's like a dandelion seed, so it's got to be very thin, very delicate font. So I just go through here and I look for it. So this font, Freestyle Script, seems to be a good, delicate font. It's got the kind of feel that I'm going for. So it gives me kind of like a starting point. So what I do next is I scale it to match my lines. So I have a good idea, where do I want the X height and everything to be? You don't have to copy, but it gives you a good idea. I think I'm going to start with that, and then as I'm drawing the letters, if anything comes up where I'm like, oh, I want to adjust this, then I can adjust it and keep going. It's a very free process where you're figuring things out as you go. Okay, so these are the letters I'm going to draw, C, E, H, T, and J. And they'll help me to pick some ideas for how I'm going to do the rest of the font. So I think these are some good letters you can start with. They give you a good starting point, and it helps you iron out any details within the font. So then, when sketching, I just reduce the opacity of my lines so that they're not in the way. I make a new layer on top in black, and then I just sketch. So the reason I like using a drawing program to do this part is because I can manipulate my letters in so many different ways. I can transform them. I can use the liquefy tool in Krita, move them around and change their shape. It gives me so many options. Now I'm moving on to lowercase e. So lowercase e is a lowercase letter, and it doesn't have anything going above the x height, the lowercase height. So I'm gonna draw the e entirely in this area. There's my initial sketch. I might just want to clean some things up like I did before. But this letter came out much easier because I already had the practice from doing the first letter. It gets faster as you go. I actually made a bit of a mistake. I drew both my letters on the same layer. It's a good idea to make a new layer for each letter. That way you can transform it easily. If you make that mistake, it's no big deal. You can just duplicate your layer and then make it so that one letter is on each layer. And the good thing about it is you'll notice right away, because you're going to want to do lots of transformations. So it won't be too big of a deal because you'll notice right away once you accidentally put two letters on the same layer. Okay, so there's my E. And now let's move on to H. The H has its line going all the way to the capital height, but its loop part only goes to the X height. So this is an example of a letter that has both lines to consider. Another thing to think about is that your thickness of your letter is relatively consistent going through. You'll notice that on the C, it got a little thicker, and so it's inconsistent. So that's something to consider as well. Things like this will make it harder to see the letters as a cohesive unit. So I like to make that check after I do every letter. I compare the thickness of the letter to the letter before it. This time I'm going to remember to make a new layer for H. And like that. You'll notice I put these above the capital height line. And I only did a little bit above. So I'm going to go into my vector layer, and I'm going to move this down. Just so that I keep that consistent going forwards. Because I do want some things to go above sometimes. And I don't want it to be too much. Mostly just the length of the dandelion seed. So that'll be a pretty good bar for me there. Once I have a letter that the first time it does something, that's when I usually adjust the lines. And I'm noticing a trend now where I have some kind of bend and curl to my letters. I'm going to try and remember that and keep that going for when I'm moving forwards to next letters. Now, because I'm doing something like that, I have to keep in mind the width of the letters is important to keep so that the letter is not jutting out in one angle. For example, something like this. If I have like a line coming out this way, because when you have a bunch of different lines like that, and then maybe I had a different letter here, like an R, now it's kind of hard to type them because I can't make the letters overlap like this without much effort because every letter is different. So one thing that's pretty important is to make it so that all the letters, oops, I don't want to crop, so that all the letters have a pretty consistent box around them, a bounding box, so that they can easily be put next to each other. You'll notice the way I curved it still is not a problem because I draw this line here. Although it is a little bit off center, it still is not too bad. There's still kind of a box around this H, and it doesn't mess up the spacing of the letters too much. It's just something to keep in mind. I write my T's like this, with a curve at the bottom. But it's also pretty good to consider all the different variations of how letters are written or represented. We've got the T like this, got T like this. And there might be some others you can find too. I think this T is actually better for this font, because it's more simple, and since the dandelion seed is a straight line, it will make it so that it's not so contorted unnecessarily. So I'm going to be doing this T, even though that's not how I write my T's. With the H, I did a curve, so with the T, I'm going to do a curve again. And to add some variation to the letters, I'm going to curve the other way. Another thing to note, there are some letters where you would be tempted to put the cross of the T right on the X height. But that's not necessary. Some letters just have things that you can place wherever you want, and T is one of them. I'm going to put the T cross where it feels natural, kind of up here. I discourage you from making a new line for things like that, because then the lines start to get too cluttered and hard to understand what is going on with them. So J has a couple things going on. It's got this dot, and it's got an underhang, which is going to help us determine how low do we want this descender line to be. I'm noticing that the dot isn't standing out enough, so I'm going to bulk it up a little bit. Now it has a similar width to the letter itself, even a little bit more, and that makes it stand out a little bit more. Now, if I place this letter right at the boundary, notice this line here gives me an indication at where the last letter ends. It's not too far away from the letter, and it doesn't look super unnatural, even though it has a hang on the left. If I hadn't adjusted it and curled it in more, I think it would have been a problem there. Okay, so here I am in Inkscape. Now, I prefer to use Inkscape for this workflow. There might be other options that you have for vectors, but Inkscape has some pretty nice features, including when we move on to making the font file, it'll allow you to just click the letter and copy and paste it into the fontforge program. So then you don't have to save every single letter individually in the files and then open them one by one. Very recommended to use Inkscape. Might take some getting used to, but it's a pretty good program. Now, some things to remember. Use the pen tool. This is what I do. I use the pen tool, and up here where the file and stuff is, I click this one, create a sequence of straight line segments. This is pretty decent, pretty quick. I'm able to make the shapes rough. Then I go here, node tool, and then I can adjust the shapes. And all I have to do to adjust them is click the line between, and then I can make the curves. So I think that's the fastest, most efficient way to trace out the letters into the correct vector paths. Each letter needs to be one shape or path. So, for example, if I make like a letter here and I make like an R, right? If I instead want to make the R go all the way in like this and have a tail, so then I make another path and I make my R like that. This is not correct. Like, this is not something that I can move and put into the fontforge. If I want to keep this as my letter, I have to click and then shift click and then do path union. And now this is one shape. You can see over here in the layers, path one. One path is the entire shape. That's what you need. So each letter has to be one path or shape. And you can use the addition or subtraction. So see how I use addition here. What if I had a situation where I was drawing the R and I had this situation and I wanted to make a hole in the middle? Well, the best way to do that is to make a pen tool, cut out the hole, and then click the first one on the outside, then click the second one, path difference. And now it's still one shape, but it has the hole in the middle. So those are some things to remember with Inkscape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my krita file, save it as an image, and then put the image into Inkscape so that I can trace over it the vectors. And then that'll give me a chance to finalize my shape. I like doing it manually. There are some ways to like automatically convert from a drawn sketch into a vector. I think that they're not perfect and it's better to do it manually, both because you can refine your shapes as you go, so it makes a more clean look at the end, and because those manual automatic conversions, although they're very good, will make some mistakes. So it's easy to avoid just by doing it manually. Okay, so now I'm back in Krita and I'm going to save an image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide all the layers, including the background, except for my letters. And then I'm going to select them and go to Image, Trim to Selection. Then I'll export. And you can export wherever you want. I'll export in my live demos folder. Now I have that file. So then if I'm in Inkscape, I can open up my files and drag it straight into Inkscape. And get it from the file, no rendering, you can just press OK. And then it goes in. Now I can zoom in on it and I have everything I need. But yeah, I like to make it so that it's less opaque, and then I start sketching over it. After I put all my points at the sharp corners of the shape, now I can do, like I said before, and go in and adjust them. Now, it's hard to see again, so what I like to do is lower the opacity again, and I like to use different colors. So for my vector shape, I use red, and then for the sketch, I use black. That way I can see everything that's behind it. The nice part about this step is I'm not exactly mimicking the shape. I'm kind of taking liberties and changing it how I want it. That's why I like doing the vectorization manually, because it helps me refine the shape in ways that I couldn't just by sketching. You'll see there's kind of like a confusing part here where they cross over weirdly. I like to adjust that first. So I take that and fix it so that I'm not super confused. And I don't like how the outer one has 2 points, but the inner one has 1. I like to mimic them. So I'm going to delete 1 point, move this here, and now it's much more consistent. And it looks absolutely crazy, but I still have the power to adjust it. One of the biggest mistakes I bet people will make is putting too many points. But yeah, less is definitely more when it comes to these. I also have a problem here, where on this point it's sharp and I don't want it to be. So you can change the type of point this is. The options are up here. Make selected nodes smooth, symmetric, auto smooth. I like smooth. Gives me more control. Once I have my letter completely sketched, I like to take it off this sketch so that I can see it just on its own. See if I want to make any changes. I think it looks pretty good though. That's going to be my C. The next thing I like to do is move it on top. That way I can pick any letters that I finish next, and I can compare them to the next letter by just dragging them up. Okay, so let's vectorize the E next. I'm going to do a slightly different strategy for this one, just to show that you can do that. So I'm going to make the fanning out part, then I'm going to make the curve part, I'm going to make the seed part, and then I'm going to join them all together. And take a circle. Then for the curve part, I'll just do a pen. Oh, and by the way, you can make multiple points smooth at the same time by quick dragging. Very, very convenient. Now I have the seed and the path, and now I can make the fanning out part separate. And now we can select them all, path, union. And that makes one shape. And all we gotta do now is lower the opacity and then clean up any little points that are extra. And just delete those extra points. And you might have to redo some parts, but nothing too crazy. And there we go. There's a different way of doing it, that it doesn't all have to be in one shape. Move this up, and kind of compare it to the C. It looks pretty good. This part looks a little thick, so I'll try to adjust that. After doing it both ways, I've decided that I like the idea of doing the seed as a separate object. That was really quick to just put the circle. But the fanning out part, I can just do it in the same object. So going forwards, I've improved the workflow for this specific font, where the seeds will be separate objects, and then the rest will be one shape. It's good to experiment, especially early on, to see what's easier. You're going to be doing a lot of letters if you're making your own font. Yeah, they look pretty good. The H looks a little bit thicker, but I think that's because the E actually has some problems. I'm going to make this a little thicker. If I compare the H to the C, it's fine. The H to the E, it wasn't. I think the E actually has some problems, where it's too thin. There we go. Now everything looks a little more uniform. Like I said, it's always good to make a quick check after doing every letter, so that's why I like to sketch it, shift it up, and then readjust. And one thing I'm noticing really is good for curves is to have the points right next to each other so that the curve is the same on both sides. So it's not super important where you put it, but just make sure that if it's on the left side here, on the right side it's similar position. Because now when I go to adjust it, it'll be a lot easier. Okay, so I'm going to join these together. And although the dot is completely separate from the rest of the J, it's got to be in the same shape. So I'm going to end up making this dot and then using the union because if you remember from the beginning, I was saying each letter needs to be one shape. So even if it's disjointed like this, you still have to union them. And it won't cause any issues or anything, but just make sure to remember to union them. So those are the letters that I'm going to vectorize for the demonstration. And now let's move on to the next stage, which is using fontforge. And this is something I can use to put all the letters into a font file. Since I don't have all the letters for this font, I'm going to use a font that I've previously created. And here are all the letters in my previously created font. So to actually move these letters into fontforge, just press new. And then it opens this window, and it has a space for each character. You don't need to fill every single character, even like the Latin ones and the mu and all different types of currency signs. Just whatever you want to make is whatever you put in here, and it'll generate, and then if there's a missing character, it'll just put like some generic letter from a generic font. But if you know that that font isn't going to use that character for, especially for your game, then it's not a problem. This is why I recommended using Inkscape, is because now we can just click each letter, Control C to copy, go into fontforge, and then paste. And there it is. It goes right in. It can double click and see it. Now, if your letter is extremely tiny right here, then what you're going to want to do is select all your letters and scale them up at the same time, holding control so that no proportions are messed up. You want to scale up the entire thing at once so that everything is the same size relative to each other. Mine was pretty good though, so I'm going to keep that same size. Go back into fontforge. Now, a couple things you have to do for each letter. You have to select everything. See these yellow boxes, so you're going to grab that. And then hold shift and drag it down so that it lines up with the bottom. And then the next thing you have to do is take this line and drag it right to the edge of where the letter ends. That's how the fontforge knows how to make it into a font file. It knows how wide each letter is so that it can space them when it creates the font file. So that's A. I'm going to save that. And you can save this as a font file and save it wherever you want. I guess I'll just put it in my downloads for now. It's a good idea to Control S to save as you're going through because it really sucks to have to redo symbols. So after every symbol, I do Control S. Now I want to make a note about the quotation marks. There are some symbols that are just placed kind of up in the air. So I like to pick a number over on the left. It gives you numbers. So I like to pick a number to put them at. So since I put this quotation mark, the bottom point of it, at 500 right here, I'm just going to remember that if there's ever another symbol like this, like the apostrophe, that's at that similar height, I'll remember 500 is the point that I'm going to put it at. So now I'm doing the apostrophe, so I'm going to grab the bottom point, hold shift, bring it down until the red line hits 500, stop, and then drag the line over. That makes it super simple so that I know which height to put my point. close it out, Control S between every symbol. Commas typically go under the line, so I'm going to choose to grab this point in the middle and hold Shift. Whatever point you grab is the point that it will use to snap to any line that it's on. So I grab the point in the middle so that it goes a little below the line. Little tricks like that are pretty helpful. Here's a hyphen. Hyphens go straight in the middle. So I remember that my quotation mark was at 500. So for this one, I'm going to make it go below 500. Let's say about that third tick mark down from 500, or that fourth one. That looks like about the middle to me. This can also be adjusted later. Fontforge is pretty quick when it comes to actually generating the fonts. So you can type, make some adjustments, and then re-export it. Colon should be kind of centered where the hyphen is. And I remember I put the bottom of the hyphen at the fourth one down from 500. So I'm going to take the middle point and put that at the fourth one down from 500. That way it's right in the middle of where the hyphen is. Always just thinking relativistically to all the other characters in your font. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's good for it to be pretty consistent. That sign is pretty big, so I'm going to let it go a little bit below the line. Like that. That's just for my font. You can do it differently if you want. You can even make little adjustments in fontforge if you notice things aren't lining up. I can just take this point and drag it down, and it'll change the shape slightly so that it hits the baseline. G goes below the baseline, so I'm going to look back at my sketch for G to remember where the baseline was. I think it was right where the top part ended, but I want to make sure. I'm going to open up my krita sketching to remember where I put the baseline. Okay, so here I have my font sketching for the thin font. And it looks like I actually placed it a little bit above the baseline. And I had an extra line there that I created. And I used it for the P and the Q as well. So I'm just going to have to eyeball where that is. Looks like it's just so that the G is kind of halfway going through the baseline. So going back to fontforge, I have a better idea where to put this G. So I'm going to grab all of these points, and then the point that I'm going to grab is right in the middle of the G, and I'm going to shift that down to the baseline. So it's kind of in the middle there. And when I get to the P and the Q, I'll kind of know what to do. And at this point, you can just look and see if any of your characters are misaligned, if one is like shoved into the corner. Then that means that you forgot to move this line for one of them, and that happens quite a lot. It looks like I was able to get all of them. They're all in the center, so it doesn't look like I'm missing any, and they're all positioned how I want them. Now, to generate the font, you just go into Generate Fonts. And I'm in my downloads right here. I'll do that for now. I like to put a true type right here. True type. And then I keep everything just how it is, and I press Generate. And there's a non-standard EM size. Convention is that true type fonts should have an EM size, which is a power of 2. I don't think exactly understands this convention, and it doesn't really affect the font. If someone wants to put in the comments what exactly the reason for this is, you can, but I ignore this. Says, do you wish to continue to generate your font? Yes. The font contains errors, self-intersecting, missing points at extrema, non-integral coordinates. I ignore these two. It seems this fontforge program seems to know a lot about conventions and how fonts are supposed to be made, but for the visual, it's going to be fun. So I generate. And it just generated it in my downloads. And here you can see all the letters. And it's looking pretty good. This is definitely good for text in a game. Not everything has to be perfect. There's some things I might change, like maybe I would move the G up, but you can do that. Another thing I want to mention, sometimes when characters have like holes in them, like the O, then it won't show up properly, and it'll be like there's just a black hole here, and it won't create the hole in the middle. If that happens, just go to your letter in Inkscape, and then click on the point inside the hole, and then go to Path, Reverse, and then that should fix it. For mine, it just made the hole again, but if you go Path, Reverse, then that should fix it and make it so that there's a hole in the actual font file. So if that happens to you, that's how you get around that. Okay, so real quick, how do you get the font into Godot? First things first, you go to the font, I have it right here, and you get the TTF file, and copy and paste it into your project. I have a folder here for fonts. I'm going to paste it in. Now when I have the Godot, I have my two fonts that I have, and I can click any node in Godot that uses text and add it in. For labels, you can go to theme overrides and then font, and then do a new font variation, and then just drag in the new font. And as you can see, it changes. It looks blurry in the editor, but it won't look blurry in the game. So if I like scale this way up, in the thing, it's like looking right at it. You go into the scene, it looks super clean. It just does that for the editor. Yeah, so you don't have to worry about that. And that is how you get it in there. There's a bunch of other ways. You can make your own theme and add it in that way. So you can have default fonts for different types of nodes, or you can use the theme overrides. I hope this was helpful. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next tutorial or other video.